Okay, so in that first section, we set up, we got our viewports configured, and we're ready to start modeling. So something we've covered slightly, just in terms of taking the tentacles apart or creating an array, making the array editable, and then being able to manipulate those points, or making a spline editable so we can manipulate our individual points. Similarly, we can make geometry editable. Right, so up until this point for 3D objects, we've just used primitives, but now we're going to turn this into a editable polygon object. And to do that, I select my cube, and I can either hit the letter C on the keyboard, or I can right-click on the cube in my hierarchy, and I can go down and go to Make Editable. There used to be a button up in here somewhere as well. Oh, I think it's down here now, is the Make Editable button. And it looks like there's some of those other common things that you do are also available there. We haven't talked about connecting objects, but we're going to. So I can also click on this button. Any of these things works. And I want you to note in the hierarchy, you can already see a change to our object. First, we have this new tag here, which is a UVW tag, which is for texturing, and we're not going to worry about that right now. And then also the icon changed from a cube to this triangle with 3 points and a plane, and that is the polygon object identifier. You'll notice, right, when we did a spline before and we made it editable, it went from whatever that primitive shape is to a squiggly with 2 dots, right? This just means this is an object we can edit the points of or the polygons of. And so once we've made an object editable, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a lot of work with these 3 modeling modes, right? We're going to be working with polygons, edges, and points today. And so if I go to polygons mode, you'll see that everything changes a little bit. And before we really get into making this X-Wing, we're just going to look at some of the things we can do here. So we're going to go ahead and we can rotate our view around. We can see our different faces. I can select an individual face. It will be highlighted in orange. Once I've selected that face, instead of moving the entire object, right, I can actually just move this individual polygon, right? And obviously the attached polygons are going to adjust with it. I can rotate this individual polygon, right? So I can adjust the geometry that way. And I can also scale it, right? So if I was to, scale this. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Hold on. Where's the blue one? There we go. If I can also, scale this down, and I can do terrible things that will break this so horribly, but I can, scale it down. I can scale it up. I have all of those ways of manipulating it. If I go to edges mode, I can do similar things, right? I can select this one edge. Now note, the edges are the axis is at like a 45-degree angle. And that's because, the edges axis is aligned halfway between the 2 faces that it opposes, which is useful for a lot of things, right? Because a lot of times you want to move something relative to the face. And so it's good to know that, I can adjust this here. If I use the scale tool, I can scale in this direction, right? You can also hold shift. You can select multiple edges. If I wanted to try and scale this to do weird, that's I don't know why you would actually want to manipulate something in that way with those 3 edges selected, but you can select multiple edges. And then if I go to points mode, surprisingly enough, I can select points and I can manipulate these points independent of all the other points, right? And you can see, I talked earlier about how even though this is a quadrangle, there's, there are, 4 points on this. It basically splits this into triangles in terms of the way it allows you to move points and things. So we can do all sorts of things like that in terms of how we manipulate this object. So I'm going to go ahead and undo a couple of steps here. I don't know. I'm just hitting undo. Okay, so I went back to being a cube. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't stretched that geometry in some strange way before we continue. Okay, so step one for making this model is to make this editable, like we said. And now we are going to do we're going to manipulate this thing, we're going to scoot some stuff around, and we're going to start thinking about how to turn this cube into an X-wing. And so to start with, I'm going to go into polygon mode. I'm going to select one of these polygons. And you can see when I select it, now I know what face that is. I'm going to leave that one alone. But what I want to do is I want to be selecting these edges, right, these sides. Now, I'd like to select both sides because it's really nice to be able to uniformly scale this in until it more or less matches the dimensions of the cockpit. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to look at symmetry because it's really annoying to try and perfectly model something on both sides of an axis when they're identical. And I can actually use the axis as a way to mirror what I'm doing on the other side. So to start with, let's go ahead and just select these two polygon faces. All right, so I have both of those edges selected. Now in my top view, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit the letter T. And I'm just going to scale this down a little bit in this direction until it kind of hugs the end of the cockpit a little bit. All right, so if I zoom in a little bit, you can kind of see I've still got a little bit of space there. I could probably snug this in just a little bit more. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with where this is starting. And now some of the other questions are, right, I also need to move this bottom polygon up. I'm trying to get our base object somewhat close, and then we're going to break it apart from there. So I'm going to rotate this view down below. I'm going to select this polygon. This time I'm going to use the move tool. So I'm going to hit the letter E on the keyboard. And you'll see with all of these changes, in polygon modeling, using our quick keys or our shortcuts is going to be really, really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this up, and I might go ahead and just zoom this view in. And this is where I also am going to be kind of keeping an eye on this model, because you'll notice that, right, I just want to make sure that this is about in the same place, and it is, right? Just don't be too worried because, right, this hangs out, but that's that back section, right? So I think we're in a pretty good spot in terms of how this model looks. Okay. So I'd like you to undo all of your steps until you get back to just having this cube primitive, because there's something I skipped ahead of and then just caught myself, and there's about 10 minutes of time you all don't even know existed that I just talked through things and realized I made a fundamental flaw right at the beginning of this process. At this point, we haven't really talked about one of the object properties or object attributes. So I'm going to select my cube in the hierarchy. I'm going to go to model mode, and I'm going to make sure my display is Gerard shading lines in my perspective view. Then I'm going to come down to the object tab on in my attributes manager. And we haven't talked about segments, right? At least not on a primitive. Right, we did talk about segments with splines. So these segments are basically how many faces are each one of these things going to be subdivided into. And because I know I'm working in the x-axis, I'm going to say segments in the x. If I click this over 1 and I have 2, what that's going to do is it's going to give me this nice even split. And so when I go to make this editable, then I'm going to have this additional geometry here. And what's nice about that is then I can select half of this cube, delete it, because I already have this edge here. Whereas if I didn't do that, I'd have to use some other tools to make a cut right on the axis. And I don't want to dealing with that precision, right? This does it for me automatically. It makes it so much easier. We're going to talk about deformers at some point. I need to make a little addendum thing. And when we do that, we'll look at with primitives, how the number of segments can impact other tools as well. But in this case, we just want to set this 1 to 2. So I've set this, I've added one segment in the X direction so that we can do things symmetrical and we can have this center line. When you work with polygon modeling and you're doing all of this detail work, you want as few polygons as possible to start. The less polygons you have while you're building out this entire model, it's going to be so much easier to make big changes, right? Because if you imagine, like, once we get all the detail in here and we're cutting a whole bunch of polygons, we've just got like a high density, things get pretty ugly pretty quickly. And so, because that means it's like that many more points you have to select and move if you need to make a change, right? And so the general like rule of thumb is to start with very few polygons and add detail as you go. Now, eventually, if you've modeled like, I don't know, a bunch of different assets, in the past, you're going to learn like when is a good time to do it. You'll figure out your own working method, but to start with, only add additional geometry when you are absolutely need to. When you're at a point where you can look over the entire model and you can be like, there's no other major feature I need to add. Now it's time to go and add more polygons so I can do some of this finer detail. And it's always good to save your file at that point too, both because then if you really screw things up or you've missed something, you can at least go back to some working point in the model. Or also, if you're developing stuff for video games, oftentimes you don't want to have, you'll with certain assets, especially if you think about like, say, foliage on a hillside in a video game or something like that, right? You want like a 3D model to be close to the character. But if you had like thousands of polygons or, on each plant all the way from as far into infinity, the resource requirements would be huge. And so what video games do to optimize that is they'll have what are called level of detail objects. And basically it'll step through, and the further away from the camera the object is, the fewer polygons, or it's going to use like a lower polygon version. And so you have to basically model each of those stages in order to have those assets ready to go so it'll flip to something that's simpler when it's further away from the camera. And so it's good to also be like, this is my low poly version. This is my medium resolution version. This is my high resolution version. Okay, so we're going to get started. We've got this one edge. We will make this editable by hitting C or clicking on this button or right clicking on the object and going down to make editable, which obviously is grayed out because I've done that. Now, the tool we're going to use to start to do this is symmetry. And symmetry is this beautiful butterfly up here. I'm going to click on this. And you'll note that, right, it creates this red plane in the middle, which is fantastic. If I click on settings for my symmetry, you'll see I have symmetries turned on. I have show planes turned on. I can always turn that off. Context is auto. And in this case, we're going to be doing modeling, but I think it's going to figure that out for us. And there's planar, there's topology, there's radial, right? There's different types, which is really useful depending on what you're modeling. In our case, we are modeling something we're going to be using planar, and we don't need symmetry in any direction except X, which is the default. But if we were to turn these different planes on, you can see, right, it illuminates which axis we're doing this along. And so if I go to points mode in my editing mode, I'm going to leave this window up for right now so we can look at this. And I click on, you notice I hover over one point, and it's going to manipulate the other point the exact same amount, which is totally awesome, right? So I can do half the work. I don't have to model the entire thing. I only have to model half of it. And it just saves me a ton of time, and it makes it much more precise than trying to individually work with both sides of this object. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually get started doing this. It should be fun, right? Okay, so we are going to go to polygon mode to start with instead of edges mode. Something else to note, if you hit the letter V on the keyboard, it brings up this like pyramid wheel diamond thing of a bunch of different settings. One is this projects. If I just drag down, if I have other projects open, this is a quick way I can select between them. If I go up to modes, this is like viewport modes. I have selection tools, snap tools, recent tools, my view, right? Camera, projects, and extensions, right? There's a bunch of different settings here. And so, yeah, so that's just something to note. I tend to use it frequently, and I don't want to forget to tell you about it. Okay, so we're in Polygon mode. So let's start by extending the front of our ship. Now you'll notice, right, I've selected this, but it selected both panes. And that's because I forgot to change this setting before we were talking. Okay, so I've deselected everything. I'm going to select my cube. I'm going to click over here so nothing is selected. And I need to see which polygon surface is the front surface. Now, something you'll note is that this is actually, right, technically the back side of this. I'm not too worried about that. We could mirror this thing, or we could change this camera to be the back. We're not going to do that. It doesn't really matter because we'll be able to see everything and manipulate these points anyway. Okay. So I've got this front surface selected. Now, there's a couple ways I could work. I could just drag this front plane out to the tip here and then start making cuts and squeezing things in. But there's also this tool called Extrude. And Extrude is over here on the side view. You'll notice that since I'm in Polygon mode, there's all these different tools that are available to me. And now they are not grayed out like previously because now I'm actually have a Polygon object I can manipulate. So Extrude is one of these tools. You'll notice that there are a couple different quick key options there. There's M tilde-T and D. So that means if I hit the letter D on the keyboard, I get the tool. If I hit the letter M on the keyboard, don't touch anything else, and then hit the letter T, you'll see that if you look down the list, T is Extrude as well, right? So either of those ways I can get to this Extrude tool. And one of the cautions with the Extrude tool is if I actually select the polygon that I want to do an extrusion of, all it does is oh, they've changed the behavior. Fantastic. This is new. In the past, it would actually just move it. And something people do that is another common error that people make when they're doing this is they will click on the move arrow as well and drag the polygon instead of creating a new subdivision, which is what we're trying to do. Where essentially what Extrude does is it'll take this surface, it'll leave an edge right where you're at, and then it'll drag this forward, creating more geometry. Right? And so if I click off in gray empty space and drag left or right, you can see, right, that I'm getting some changes here. If I, conversely, if I was to, I can actually now, I guess, click on the polygon itself and have the same thing. The big thing is just don't click on the move tool, right? That's something I've seen students have issues with a lot previously. Okay, so we've got our Extrude tool. Now, one thing, I should note is that before we do this extrusion, we might want to do a little bit more shaping on this object so it fits our X-wing a little bit better before we go and extrude any further. So let's go ahead and go to our right view. We are going to go to points mode. And the reason we're doing points mode is because we can select these points and manipulate these through. Now you'll note that for whatever reason, oh, okay. So we're going to select points mode because what's nice about points mode for this is we can get all the points aligned here and we can move them all together. Now, you'll note that I'm in symmetry mode, right? So when I pull this down, you'd think that, and I'm going to move this forward a little bit too, just so you can see, but you would think that this point should move as well, right? And be selected similarly. But if we go back and we remember, we have it's the central point, right? We're only going to be manipulating the mirrored points that are not resting on that central plane. So I need to be able to select all three of those points. And it'd be kind of obnoxious. I'm going to go ahead and undo these steps real quick, but it'd be kind of obnoxious to have to do it in this view. And so there is this brush selection tool, and the brush selection tool allows me to, I can click and drag to select things. Now you'll note when I do that, it still hasn't selected that center point. And that's because in the attributes for this tool, there's this visible only checkbox. And what visible only means is that it's only going to select the point that the camera can see. That's a direct line of sight between me, my mouse, and what's underneath it, right? If there's actually 3 points aligned here, right? But I'm only going to be selecting the first one. Now, if I uncheck visible only and click on this first point, and then pop back here, you'll see all 3 of those points are selected. Right? This is a really, really useful tool. It's very easy to forget what you have if you have it turned on or not. Something to note, if you have a setting like this that you use frequently, you can click it and drag it and drop it into the window that you're currently working on. And you can click on the word, and if it's highlighted in purple, that means it's checkmarked, and if it's not, that means it's unchecked. So I know I'm going to be using this a lot, so I am going to have that hang out there in empty space. All right, so what I want to do is I want to grab this axis. I want you to note something as well. Even if I go back to the move tool, a lot of people will want to drag this point by clicking on the point. However, what you're actually doing, and if I go back to this view, is you're clicking on the axis that's pointing towards you. So if I click here, you'll see I'm actually sliding those points back and forth, not in the dimension that I want them to move, right? So you'll be like, oh, I'm clicking on this and nothing's happening. Well, if you do this several times and you don't realize what's going on, then you go back to your perspective view and your model's all smeared all over 3D space. So what you want to do is you want to be make sure you're using the axes, right? I'm going to not be selecting this point. I'm going to be using the axes to do this. So I'm going to pop back to full screen for this. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this down right where kind of all those seams for the windscreen are. I'm going to go down to this bottom corner, and if I hit the space bar, that is sort of the default selection tool for this or for the last tool that I used, right? And the brush selection tool, it's also the number 9 on the keyboard. So if I select these 3 points, and I can go ahead, and what I would like to do is try and keep my this plane as vertical as possible, right? I don't want to have this like angled forward or angled back. If it's off by a couple degrees, it doesn't matter, but we do have these nice vertical lines that we can use to align this stuff with. So now I'm going to go ahead and go here, and even though, right, I know I need to put a windscreen on there, I'm going to go down to the body of this to start with, and eventually we will come in and we will add an additional cut here to add that geometry. But to start with, we're just going to try and go with the basics of this body. And again, right, once I add this additional geometry here, I'm going to need to bridge out and expand there, and we'll do that in a little bit. Okay. So I've got it done in this dimension. Let's go ahead and go to our top view, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come down here. We're in points mode. I'm going to select all of these points, and I'm going to drag them in, and with symmetry, they both drag in. It's so awesome. There used to be some other tools you had to use to do this, and they've just made it so much more efficient. And I'm going to snug that up to the body of the X-Wing as well. Now I'm going to go back to perspective view, and it's starting to look less like a box. I'm going to come here. I'm going to go forward. And this is, right, this view at this point is a little bit tricky because we don't quite know where things are going. I'm going to change this display to just lines because it's going to be a little bit easier to see. Now, I've already got these points selected, and I'm not going to worry about much in this view right now. we're going to be tapering all of this based on the other two views, but eventually once we need to turn this into more of like an octagonal or whatever, however many facets this is shape, then we're going to be using the front view more. Okay, so we've got this set. So let's go ahead and use our extrude tool now, and we're going to want to extrude this front surface. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit the letter D on the keyboard for extrude. Then I need to change from points mode to polygons mode. And once I do that, I'm going to go to my top view, and at this point, right, there's not a whole lot of change in geometry until I get to the nose of the aircraft, so, or the spacecraft. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to click and drag and extrude until I get there. All right, so I'm just going to keep going, keep going, keep going. There we go. If for whatever reason, like your trackpad won't like let you get all the way, you could even go like that much. Then you could select this axis and actually drag it where you need it to be, right? As long as you get that one polygon of space. Now, something to note, sometimes when people use extrude, they stutter a little bit. They might like click and drag just a touch and click and drag just a touch. If you do that, what it's going to do is it's going to create, you can see if I zoom in, I actually have like several segments in here, and that's problematic, right? That's a very common thing that when you're beginning the model you do. So you want to, once you've started to extrude it, don't do a second extrusion, right? You just want to then move this forward. And there's a lot of options here. You can have more than one subdivision when you do an extrusion. In our case, just having the one right now is perfect. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go back to points mode, and we're going to do kind of the same steps. Now note that all of these points are selected right now, so I want to hit the space bar to grab my live selection tool, and I just want to select those points and drag this in and taper it until it kind of aligns with the body there. Once I've done that, I can pop over to my right view. I can come over here and I can attempt to do the same thing, but you'll notice my axis is right here in the center. That would mean I'm actually, if I was to move this, right, the whole thing is going to go down, and I don't have that center line selected, right? So I'm going to have, oops, I was going to just show you the view, right? Things are not going to be going the way they should be going. So I don't want to do that, right? I want to make sure I hit undo, click off in space, select again. So I have all three of these points selected. And right, I'm not doing this because this isn't uniform top to bottom. I'm going to do these independently. So I'm going to drag this one down on its own. I'm going to select the lower points and pull these up as well. Okay. So now here's another great moment for an extrusion. And I want you to note, like in this case, we're going to have there's this crazy arced cutout and things that are going to happen. We're not going to worry about that right now. All we're going to do is we're going to extrude to this edge, and then we will extrude to the tip of the model. So I'm going to go ahead and pop back into what's it called, view. I want you to note when I go back to polygons mode, this same surface, this same front surface is already selected, right? By default, it'll keep that selection. And so now that I've got that selected already, I'm going to hit the letter D to go back to my extrude tool. And I am going to extrude to this edge. And again, I'm just going to click off in space because I can't select the actual polygon very easily in this view. But if I just click in space and drag, right, I'm going to get that. Now, if I just click, it's going to deselect it, which isn't what I want to do, right? So I've clicked and dragged, and I'm going to click drag one more time until this is at the tip of the nose cone. And this is where I want you to note this is like pretty close, right? But it's like not quite exactly the right scale, but we're not going to worry about it because it's really, really close. Now that I've done this, I can switch back to points mode. And you'll notice again, you have to be careful. All of these points are selected from these edges that I copied because it's going to copy those selections too. So I need to use my space bar. And I could either do the top view or the front view first. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go top view, drag this in a little bit more, and then I'm going to deselect everything, select this top edge, and I'm not going to try and get this right all the way down. I'm actually going to go to where there's that harder curve. So basically, once this ceases being somewhat aligned, and I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not going to drag all the way down here where it's bisecting that. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to select this. I'm going to pull it up until it matches and then flies free. Okay, so already we've started to get something that's much closer to an X-Wing than it was previously, which is pretty fantastic. And I'm going to go ahead and save this now. This is a great time to save. So we've got a handful of points, right? This the fuselage is, at least the front half is pretty much ready to go. And again, what I said is, the more points we have, the more problematic selecting and manipulating all of this is. Now, I do want you to note that as it stands, it'd be great if these corners were a little bit more aligned to where these, diamonds are, but we're not quite there yet. Okay, let's go ahead and model the back end of the ship, and then we will move from there. So let's go ahead, and you can see we're about halfway there, and we're not going to worry about wings at this point. We're really just trying to get the body done. So now that I've got my views somewhat scaled, I'm going to rotate my view so I can grab this back polygon. I'm going to go into Polygons view, select that polygon. Oh, and you'll note I've accidentally selected a whole bunch of stuff. And that's because, visible only is turned off. So I want to turn visible only back on, click off in space, and then just click this one polygon. So that's something, again, you got to be aware of. You just got to pay attention, because otherwise you might accidentally select things you don't intend to. Now that I've done that, I can either be in my top view or my rear view, or my side view, excuse me. And I can either, in this case, I think I'm going to pull this all the way back to the back of the fuselage. So I'm going to hit D. And remember, I don't want to select the move tool. I just want to click off in space, and I want to click drag. And even though I want to move it, I'm dragging the opposite direction I want to move it. This tool works with motion in one direction meaning one thing, motion the other direction meaning the other. It doesn't change based on which direction you want to pull that surface. Okay, so I've pulled that back to the back. Fantastic. And now we are in a reasonably good spot, but we might want to start manipulating some of the dimensions of this, Just like we did on the front. This area actually needs to drop down to fill out some of the body of the X-Wing. So I'm going to be in this side view, and I'm going to go to points mode. I'm going to hit spacebar, so I select my selection tool, and I want to turn this brush selection visible only off. Again, if you didn't hear it earlier, you just click drag this into the window, and then you've got this nice little thing there, so you don't have to go all the way over there to select that option. I'm going to select these points here, and I'm just going to start the downward motion a little bit. And then I'm going to go back here on the back side, and I'm going to pull these all the way down. Now, these engines are not part of this, but I know from over here that this is about, and I probably went a little too far, but this is about where that point needs to be, somewhere in there. Again, I can always manipulate this a bit more in the future. Now, with that, we do have several places here where we could use a bit more geometry. And adding a couple subdivisions isn't going to be a huge problem. But it may at this point, but we don't want to go too crazy right now. So I'm going to save it as it stands. And I am going to go ahead, and I want to add one here so I can kind of get this basic shape up here down and the basic shape down here down. And then I want to add one here where there's this transition. And this is a pretty hard transition, but we're going to go ahead and try and make that happen. So how do we do that? There's a tool over here that looks like a knife. That's the cut tool. Underneath the cut tool, there's a couple of different options. There's plane cut and loop path cut. We're going to be using loop path cut. And the way loop path cut works is if I go ahead and select that tool, I can hover anywhere on my model. And as long as Cinema can make a loop, it's going to be very happy. Now, at some point in this model making, people oftentimes unintentionally double click things and make more geometry than they're expecting, or something else breaks. But ideally, with the new symmetry tool, we should be able to do loop cuts for quite a while. Part of the reason we're not making the wings yet is when we start doing those extrusions and pulling those out from the body, that can break some of the loop cutting stuff. And so we really want to make this as pleasant as possible. Now, the model we're making, right, the wings won't be able to like articulate. And that's something we could potentially change, honestly, as I do this tutorial, is we could have the wings be independent. Maybe we'll do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and make these cuts. That was a fault of my previous tutorial, and I think we should rectify that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, and to make this cut, all I do is I want to hover over where I want the cut to be. Now, I showed you the perspective view, right? This is a loop all the way around, even though we just see this one edge. And then I just want to click. Once I've clicked, if I hit escape afterwards, once I've clicked, this whole thing comes up. I can go in here and I can actually move this around before I've set any of this, any of these settings, which is really nice. I can like be really precise with it. Once I'm happy, I hit the escape key, and the escape key will set that cut. Okay, so I've set that cut. I'm going to go ahead and make the cut here as well. So I'm just kind of hovering over those lines. I'm going to click once. I'm happy with where it is, so I'm going to hit escape. Now that I've done that, I can hit the space bar, or I can click here, and I have visible only off. So I can select this and I can drag this up so that this more or less matches that slope. You'll notice, right, I'm going to need more geometry eventually, but we're not going to put that in yet. And I'm going to go down here to the bottom, pull these points up, come down here, pull this point down. And so I hope you can see that as you get more used to this, and I know I'm bringing this up here, and I know, right, we're going to need to have a hard edge there. We're not going to do that yet. And then this, it looks like, I can't remember how this tapers because it's hidden. We could look at another reference. I may actually go ahead and just pull this up to be square flush with the back, and we'll deal with that detail a little bit later once we have more information available. Okay. So we have the whole fuselage blocked out. Let's go ahead and hit save.